Assalamualaikum and good morning to all participants of today's webinar session. And it's a good afternoon to you, Dr. Saiyidi. Right, this 1 hour webinar will walk you through the nuts and bolts of the survey-based research. And specifically, in this session, we'll be addressing the common issues with sample size, translating research variables into items in the questionnaire, and a quick run on the data analysis methods. Firstly, before we move on with Dr. Saidi's speech, we will first be going through some housekeeping rules. So the first one is this live webinar will be recorded and will consist of 45 minutes of presentation by our speaker and another 15 minutes of a Q&A session by participants. Those who are interested in asking a question may post it in the chat column or simply raise their hand using the button provided on the screen. And throughout the presentation, participants are advised to mute their microphones to avoid any disruptions. Last but not least, a QR code and a link for attendance will be shared at the end of today's session. Before we continue, let's first open this session today by reciting the Surah Al-Fatiha. Okay, moving on, allow me to first introduce myself. My name is Amira Izzati binti Syarahma, and I will be the moderator for today's program. I am pleased to welcome Dr. Saiyidi Roni, who will be sharing about the nuts and bolts of the survey-based research. But before that, let's indulge in our speaker's background. So Dr. Saiyidi Roni is the lead author of 2 statistical analysis books published by Springer. His first book, published in 2020, is averaging 100 downloads per week and has recorded close to 7,000 downloads as of February 2021. His second book, Data Analysis with SPSS for Survey-Based Research, is expected to enter the market in the second quarter of 2021. Dr. Saiyidi has been sought after by many research parties from several social science disciplines across Australia and abroad. His statistical powers extends from the conventional multivariate analysis to partial least square, and also to artificial neural network, which is part of the artificial intelligence.
All right, thank you. I'm just doing a little bit of sound check. Can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yes, you're clear. Your audio is
okay,
clear.
all right, thank you. All right, thanks. Again, thank you, Amira, for the for reciting that. I think I should tone down the my CV a little bit. But anyway, thank you, Amira, for that. And thank you to the associate professor, a really good friend of mine, Dr. Sharo, and of course the Dr. Rahima as well. Really appreciate for the invitations, and yeah, I try to share with you guys with a bit of a not exactly the entire nuts and bolts of a research, but a few I think tips and tricks that that might be helpful to get things running. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have my presentation. Hopefully that you can see my screen. Is it coming up or not? Doesn't seem to be. Let me just bring that one up again. I should be able to bring my screen for you guys. I have 3 different screens I'm working on, and then of course my camera is far on my right. So if I turn my head around, it doesn't mean that I'm neglecting you guys. It's just a matter of where the screens I'm looking at. So a little bit confusing. All right. So yeah, there are 2 books that I've written. So the first one was Accidental So I would say the first one, which is here, was accidental. It's not planned. It just happened to be that I was the authors, the rest of the teams of Margaret and Julia, where we were working on a very large data set, and at that time for the survey, it's a 997, and we would like to while coming out with a paper, there's so much of data analysis that we have to do, and most of the data that actually has to be run or analyzed in non-parametric ways. So that's how we thought that since we invested so much, few months in analyzing data using the non-parametric, why don't we come out with a book on the non-parametric statistic analysis? So that's what we had before. And then as Amirada said earlier, the second book will be coming up it was planned to come out on the 8th of May. Hopefully that will be that's a promise of spring. That's about the book. So what we're going to do today is looking at two things. Right? So it's not that much. It's not that much. 45 minutes. I think it should be fine with it. So first thing first, we need to look at the sample. This is something to do that question that we always ask ourselves. What will be the sample? So because that will be the key element to get the data done for us. The other part will be the instruments itself, the survey. So when it comes to the survey, we look into two aspects of the surveys. One is the items in the survey itself, which is very, very much what we want to see, but not every single one of it. Just tips and tricks on how to come out with the items for the survey questions. The other one would be the validity and reliability, things that we want to make sure that when we get the data, and in fact the instrument itself is technically valid. I learned a lot from Dr. Shahrul earlier, that he actually came over to the ECU a couple of years back. I think it's about 3 years ago. He came over and then presented about the social desirability bias. Social desirability bias is something that we need to take into considerations, but it's not covered in these sessions. Perhaps I'm promoting Dr. Shahrul at the same time. I want to consult him when it comes to the social desirability bias there, which we have to look at when it comes to the survey-based research. All right, so let's have a look at a sample. So normally when it comes to the sample, this is always the first question that always comes to me whenever my PhD students or research student is to come up with or to determine the sample size. This is the question. How many samples should I collect? So this is only these are the main question to come out with. So I always ask myself, how large a sample size is sufficiently substantial, and how small is the sample size is for it to become inadequately limited. So how large is large and how small is small? There's no magic number, unfortunately. Right? So there's no magic number to determine whether or not sample size is basically our sample is large or small or sufficiently large. Then we need to look at what we are trying to find. So the objective or the main objective when it comes to any research is the question of generalizability. Whether the findings that we have can be, or that we found from that study can be generalized to the entire populations. All right. So generalizability. I have a tongue twister this morning. All right. So we'll be looking at. Right, so we'll be looking at whether the result is reliable and the findings are practically credible. And in order to do that, we need to look at when it comes to the credibility. So we'll be looking at the procedures. So the way that we collect our data, the way that we identify the sample, that makes our samples the samples will be, I would say, much more credible. The other part will be the reliability that we can test through the statistical analysis. All right. So credibility. So we look into so how to basically come out with the procedures to make sure that the data is representative. So to do that, we need to identify what will be the populations of interest. Right? So what will be the populations of interest, and then we might want to stratify them. according to the groups that we want to identify. And sometimes this is post hoc. It is not before the analysis. It is after it's not before the collecting data, but after we collected data, we found out that there's something which is not that right with our sample. We might have cast our net too wide, that we encroach into subpopulations. And that is what we call the data-driven approach. We look at the distributions of our samples, of the data, whether there is a bimodal. Bimodal means that sometimes we find there are two peaks instead of just a normal peak of a normal distribution types of data. We have basically two peaks and a twin tower. I just call it twin tower because I had that one experience before. So if that's the case, we might be looking at two different populations or subpopulations altogether. In that case, we might want to remove one or analyze them differently, or we put something like control variable. Right. So I'll give you one example. This is a really great example. Why do they call it great? This is about financial literacy. This is a survey conducted on 15-year-old, about the financial literacy over 90 countries in the world with a data set of more than 200,000 responses. So it's huge. It's a massive amount of data. This is what we call PISA. PISA stands for the Program for International Student Assessment, and they did this every 2 years. So the last data that we had was in 2018. It was released in 2020 for everyone to look at. And I have some spare time. I looked into the financial literacy aspect. There are lots of it, and lots of inside it. But I just looked at the financial literacy scale. There are couples of measurements or items that measure to what we call this financial literacy, and then I'm writing a paper on it as well, together with my co-author Margaret. All right, so if you look at over here, we can see that this is a population, the scale of the total amount or the total values of financial literacy measurements in the for the entire population. So now, okay, that looks weird because they have three peaks there. Right, so we have people who or students or 15-year-old has not that really good in terms of financial literacy. We have a lot over here, right, strike in the middle, and then also there's a high peak there. Most financially literate 15-year-old. So there are three peaks there. Is that representative? This is overall. It's about 200,000. Responses. So what I did was that I looked at every single country, not all, some of them, and I took a sample, and this is what I found. So I looked at Brazil. These are some of the countries that I looked into, and this is Moscow, which is Russia, basically Russia, US, and we can see that from there. So every single country actually have three peaks, and that peaks are actually resonant. Every single country, all those three peaks actually resonates in the entire populations. This is a really good example of sample representativeness. So if I were to broadcast in Russia, in Moscow, in the United States, in Spain, now I will get this distribution. I will be really much confident to say about the population as a whole. And I'm very much confident in terms of generalizability of my findings, because all of these countries that actually have three peaks. It is so amazing to see how good the sampling process was. But obviously, this is under OECD. They have lots of budget. We are talking about millions and millions of budgets to actually run this program and have to collect this data. But the way that it is cast and the way it is extracted is a really good representations of the entire populations, even if we go to every single country. So if I analyze something in one single country, I can generalize. I'm very much confident to generalize my findings in for the entire populations. Right. So that's about it. That's about having credibility. It's always about procedure. We need to identify the populations of interest, stratify them into the groups that we are really interested in. And of course, sometimes we look at the data, This is post, right? So the third approach is basically post data collections. Most of the time, we look at the first two. Identify the populations of interest and stratify them according to the things that we need. Sometimes we say that we just want to see the financial literacy among students, that we might want to stratify them, right? So identify the actual group. So for the PISA project, the Program for International Student Assessment, they identify only 15-year-old. Right? So only 15-year-old. So that the one that they actually came up with. All right. So that's about credibility, right? Having credibility, so that our output becomes a proceed. The outcomes, right? So the outcomes of the findings, it becomes more generalizable. Right. The next one would be the reliability. How can we make sure that our instruments or our data is actually reliable? This is where we have the priority, right? So it's not Priority of Science, one of my favorite movies, right? So priority is a known effect size of expected statistical power. It's always adapted. So, when the couples of a email that came through, almost every 2 months, and I got the questions about statistical power. From research students, because their supervisor asked them to actually identify the sample size and also estimate the statistical power. So normally what we do, this is much more related to it. So what I normally do is that whenever that I want to get into to determine the minimum sample size, right? So the rule of sample size is the higher is always better, right? The more that we have, the larger sample, it's always better, always, right? Most of the time, right? So the things when we have is that when we have a priority, we estimate the known effects. We can actually estimate the minimum sample size. So giving an example over here, I normally use a G power. I was introduced to G power a long time ago. I think way back in 2006. 2006. How long was it? Man, I'm getting old. But anyway, so when it comes to the G power, so I was first introduced to it a long time ago. And then the things that we do when it comes to the G power is that we can estimate depending on the main analysis. Some people say that, I use a regression, so I use the correlation, and also use a t-test. The good idea is, look at the main analysis. If you're testing your regression, if the regression is the main analysis of your study, you might want to look at the regression itself. So to do this, right, to do that, by the way, the G power is actually, you can download it for free. So in this case, I give you an example of F-test. F-test is under the linear regressions, right? So, the linear regressions is under F-test. All right, so F statistics. If you want to know your regression model actually worked or good, that's where we use the F-test. But if you want to see the past coefficients, the beta of your regressions, that line, whether that regression line is actually correct or whether that is actually sufficient, and that in that case you need to use a t-test. Right? So t-family, right? The test family is under t-test because typically that's how it works. All right, so giving an example over here, just to estimate whether or not our model actually works and how large I would say the sample size would be the minimum sample size, not the entire thing. So we put over here, this is what we call this effect size of 0.15. There are 3 different effect size over here. So we have a small, mediums, and large. Depending on what type of test that you want to do, you might want to specify them. So there are cutoff, right? So three different types of effect size. What does it mean by the effect size? Assuming that our regressions or correlation is statistically significant. It's so significant, statistically speaking, right? So significant, statistically speaking. So which means that the p-value might be less than 0.0001. So if the p-value is less than 0.00001, it's highly significant, but statistically speaking, practically, is that good enough? That's why we look at the effect size. Because sometimes sometimes the result can be really highly statistically significant, but for practical purpose, it's just nothing. It can happen that way as well. So we just have to be careful with that. So technically, if you download the G-Power, you can, whichever test that you run, it gives you straight away what will be the cutoff point for the small, mediums, and large. Right. So if it's a large effect, typically, if you run it, if you throw a stone, you hit someone there. Most of the time, you will hit someone there. And then if that will be the sample size, typically will be required sample size. The minimum required sample size will be really not that really large, right? It's just very small. All right. So by default, it goes to the effect size over here will be around medium effect. So normally, right? So if you put a small effect, all right, so the effect size over here is small, then you need to have a larger sample size. It's simple as this. If you cannot find, all right, there is a risk of not finding the effect, so you need to have a larger sample. That will be the typical thing that we do. If you know that the effect is always there, then even small sample can actually confirm our hypothesis. All right, so that's what we do. So this is one of the many examples that you can use. All right, practically I use a G-Power. Again, Google G-Power, download it, install it, play around with it. It's really good. All right, and I always encourage you to do this before you start your project. Before you actually identify what you want to do, it's always a good idea to just take a glance on it. Right? So in this case, for the numbers of predictors, right? This is medium sample. I think it's a medium. Yeah, it is a medium effect size for the F family test over here, and then we have a numbers of predictors of 5, right? And we can see that the total sample size is 138. This is minimum, so we need to hit this minimum 138 to make sure that the result is statistically significant, so reliable. Right, and the actual power is 0.95%, which is really great. All right. Okay, so that's one of the many ways to actually run. I think we can run a course of workshops on how to use a G-Power, right, on its own. Okay, so that's about the sample size. So when it comes to the sample size, again, we need to determine, try to figure out. Right? So normally the literature gives you an example. One or two literature give you what will be the effect size of the phenomenon that we would like to find. That will translate. We can use that as a basis to key in or to put the expected effect size, and then what would be the minimum sample size for our test. I mean, for our study. So that's about when it comes to sample size. It's always about the procedure, and it's always about the statistical power. All right. The next part will be the survey instruments. Right. So the survey instruments. This is fun, all right. Well, that's basically our the instrument that we use for the collect data. Right. So normally we have two parts of the survey instrument. It's not just the survey itself, but it also has to have what the information letter. Right. So the information letter is typically it's just an invitation letter, but there are a couple of things that we need to highlight when it comes to the information letter. Right. So we go one by one at the items. Let's go with the information. I'll give you an example over here. So this is the example of a research project that I did. Where we have a research grant earlier. So I think it was about 2 years ago. We did this information letter and an example of it. So what are the components in information? Tell the audience what the project is all about. And obviously, the title will be good. And then tell them about the ethics. Right. In many countries, ethics in research is mandatory. Right. So in Malaysia, I suppose we are moving towards that as well. So ethics is something that we need to highlight. And I have one experience before that one of our research paper was actually questionable, because when we submitted it, we didn't actually say anything about the ethics approval from the university. The reviewers had to pick that one up and ask for the ethic proof that the project was actually covered or approved by the ethic committee of the university. When we provided that information, turns out to be that they are in doubt. They thought that sounds like backdated, even though it wasn't backdated. So our paper, we decided to withdraw our paper from that journal. Some journals are really critical in terms of ethics. One of the main things, they want to protect the journal, the credibility of the journal as well. Right, so always a good idea, even if it's not required in Malaysia or in some other countries. You may want to take a glance into the ethics as well, ethics approval. So that's one thing. And then the other thing that we might want to highlight is, where do we get the contact details of our target audience? Tell them where we get the contact detail. So just to let them know that this is non-random stuff that we send out. So we know them, we know the contacts, we know the emails, we know the phone numbers, because where did we find it? Right? So it might be that someone recommended that this is a person that that we should be able to do it or highlight. And sometimes we got the email from the publicly available information, things like the website of the university. Right? And then the other thing that we might want to highlight as well is to if there is any concern regarding the survey, we ask the participants to actually send us an email or contact us, or perhaps contact independent parties. In this case, at ECU, we use the research ethics office. And trust me, basically, some people just have so much of ample time. They wrote a complaint with the research ethics. I had that one experience, not this project, the other project before. It took us about 2 days to resolve that complaint. Turns out to be the complainant did not read the information letter. There was a link to the information letter saying that where we get their contact details from. But it took us 2 days and many man hours and several departments to resolve that issue. That was fun doing a research. Okay, right. So that's about the information letter, and then we zoom into what we call the items. That's a fun part. Right? So when it comes to the items, let's take a look at the items itself. Normally we have two groups or two groups of the two sections in the survey instruments. Right? Apart from the information letter, when it comes to the items, we have the demographic parts. We want to understand, we want to learn more about our participants. That's where we have demographics. And the other one is the variables of interest. These are the ones that basically related to at the second part of the variables are the ones that related to our research. Right? So let's have a look at an example of demography. Right? So questions in the survey just randomly picked up. Right. So we have this is a sample, by the way. This is a sample that I found in some of the surveys that I received and some of the survey instruments that I've been asked to actually take a look. Right. So please select the relevant options: age, sex, race. It's not ethics. Right? So it's ethnics over here. That's a spelling error. One there. Right. Okay. So apart from the spelling error, what do you think about this demographic sections of this survey? You can use your mic or you can also type in. All right, 1 minute. What do you think about this demographic? What would you think about the questions? What do you think about the way these questions are asked to the participants? $29. And then we have
basically, doctor. So
Sorry?
the issue would be how do you come about to group the age variable? Okay, what makes you decide to group the age variable to this particular groupings section? Okay, 21 to 30 years old, 31 to 40 years old. Okay, in terms of why?
Yes, that would be great. So, Dr. Sharong, thank you so much. One of the many things, but seems like Dr. Sharong has seen my. I thought I haven't sent out my slide to anyone. This is going to be. So basically, Dr. Sharong can see that what's coming. Right. So the first one is about the grouping. Right. The other part will be the way it is asked, it's very like, it's more like forcing people to ask. Right? Sometimes, if you want to make people feel comfortable in answering the questions, it's what we want to do is to make them feel that we are talking, we're speaking with them. Right? So take a look at this about asking about the age. So the first part will be, please tell us about yourself. And my age is right. So that will be my age is, and let's say 30 years old, or 20 years old. So that convey situations of what we call this term of interactivity between we, the researcher, and the respondent. Right. And sometimes people feel that, okay, giving out the actual numbers of years, all right, the actual age is very private, so they're not that comfortable, and then we might want to rephrase it. Right? Rephrase it. We are still asking for the age, but instead of directly asking how old are you, we just simply say, I was born in the year, and then we can extrapolate after that. What will be the age of the participant? Right? And then, of course, right, the way that Dr. Shah was actually highlighted before, right, put in a group. Right? So it's always the questions, again, that brings us to the question, so how do we group them? Because this is arbitrary. Right? So this is arbitrary. Right? And then the other thing that we might want to look at over here before we move to the next slide, right? So this is what before we move on to the next parts about these changes or grouping the participant into the age groups that can be, it basically has some complications later. The other thing that we might want to look at is the other two. Right? So the other two questions in the samples here. So the second question is about sex over here. This is whether they are male or female. Some research, or actually this is the way that I've been looking back, especially in Australia, because of the what we call this equity, equal access to everything, and then the respect to the participants of a research. They now have another two more options. It's a male, female, undetermined, and then the next one will be I'm not comfortable to disclose or refuse to disclose. So we give them options to remain more anonymous in certain ways. Right? Not only male or female, that's the other one is undetermined. And the fourth one, or the fourth option is I don't want to disclose. They opt not to disclose. So typically, this has now become a standard practice in Australia. The other one would be the race or ethnics. This is really hard to get through in Australia. So we are not, typically university are not comfortable if we have a question asking their ethnic background. If you're conducting research in some other country, you might want to look into what would be the practice in those countries. But in Australia, this is hardly passed. This is hardly, about the ethnics is hardly past the ethics committee, unless we can strongly justify why we need this. Right? Obviously, this part becomes the risk is this. So having this ethnic or race is it could lead to some other I would say discriminations in certain ways. That will be something that universities are not willing to take. That kind of risk that we are not willing to take. And I believe that if we put a race over here, even if it's approved by the ethics committee, it will, basically the university that approve that ethics will have to take higher premiums, say insurance premiums. Yes, so basically, the university in Australia, so whenever that we have a research coming up, or we request for research and surveys, they normally have an insurance on top of So once it's approved by the ethics, so that will be an insurance paid by the university in case anything happens. All right. So that's about the demographic. We just have to be careful with it. All right. The other part will be just like what Dr. Sharad actually highlighted before is the grouping. All right. So the grouping of age in this case will have implications. So whatever that we do, when it comes to the grouping, so we actually have something what we call this the effect, the final effect will be the statistical test. What will be the options available? All right. So if we ask about the age in terms of the actual number, actual age, the same goes when it comes to the year that the respondent is actually born. So that level of details, right, that levels of detail will actually, the variable that we get from it is more or less on the scale types of the variable. If we have a scale type, it's much more preferable. So in terms of hierarchy, scale variable is highly I would say praised in terms of the strengths, in terms of the ability to run lots of other tests. Right. So scale is what we want to have, but when we change into grouping, that becomes lower level or second level types of the data quality. So in that case, it's no longer scale. Right? It is what we call ordinal. They have an order. So this grouping actually have an order. So this is less than this. The second group, the third group is actually more than in terms of age. It's more than the second group and so on. So that becomes an ordinal. So the way that we actually refine the response, right, the response options will dictate what will be the test that we are able to run. Right? So be careful when we want to look into I would say grouping or changing the response type of our items in the analysis. Right. And apart from that, and then we always have, when it comes to the survey, we always have this. So we have something like strongly agree, strongly disagree, the Likert scale type, anchor that properly. Right. So the worst thing that a researcher can do is basically have a mixture of different levels of scales in the instrument. It's good in certain ways, but it's miserable in many others. Right, so some might be in the scale of 1 to 7, the other will be 1 to 2, the other will be 1 to 5. If you could have it standardized, it would be lovely. Why? Because it makes your life much more easier in terms of getting things done, in terms of getting, what would be the, if I would say that, how many of, if you want to describe, right, if you want to describe your data, right, descriptive analysis always come out as in the front when it comes to writing out the result of the analysis or result of your study. And so if you want to describe, right, so you might want to say that on average, people agree. It's about 3.1 out of 5 point scale. But if you have a mixture of 7 and then you have another mixture of 7s and 3s and 5, that makes things much harder. All right. So always anchor that properly. I do have 2-page long about this anchor. I like this various coming up with 2-page of the what we call the Likert type scale response anchors. So from the frequency, from the very I would say from normal levels of agreements, and so these are really good. Right? So whether you want to have a 7 anchor or you want to have a 5-point anchor, so these are the things. I might share the link to with Dr. Shahrul later, and then Dr. Shahrul can actually distribute to the participants. Right. So this is part of the things that you might want to think about as well. The other thing is when we design the questions, right? The other thing where we need to make sure it's a very typical stuff that we need to do. There's making sure that the statements are actually clear and concise. And then we also have to make sure that we avoid multi-dimensional statements. Take a look at this example. What do you think about it? And in the meantime, I'm looking at it, Tahira. All right. I'll get back to your questions later when we have. It's a good question, sir, Tahira.
Thank you.
All right. All right. If you look at the examples over here, so we have two dimensions there. The online learning demands more self-disciplines and self-motivations. Right. Some people say, yeah, online learning is actually requires more self-disciplines, but doesn't necessarily mean to have that the person would actually have that motivations to do. So this is what we call the multidimensional. So my response when I was looking at these questions, survey questions before, and I was asked to look into that, so this is a multidimensional. So if it's multidimensional, it creates a little bit of confusions from the respondent, and in that case, the responses, the data that we collect might not be a true reflections of what we try to measure. Right. So in that case, what I suggested to the group research group before, right, that consulted me on this, I think break this into two, as simple as that, because we don't want to have multidimensional statements in our research questions, right? So we want to take as precise as possible, right? The other part that we want to do, right, when it comes to research questions, what to ask, right? Basically we ask questions related to our variables. So I'll give you an example over here. We want to measure trust. So this is a latent variable. What it means by latent variable is that the variable cannot be measured directly. So we measure through indicators. Right. So in order to measure a latent variable, in these cases, trust, which is conceptual, so we need to identify the indicators. So those indicators are actually dimensions. Right. So how do we come up with this? I like this paper, right? What I've been reading that for quite some time. It's nice. So this group actually come up with how to define trust in the mobile commerce. So they identify all of this. A good literature review. So if you want to conduct research on the mobile commerce, I think you might want to get your hands on this paper. It helps you a lot. I like it. But in this case, all right, let's have a look at the trust. How do we ask about trust? How do we measure trust through our question? So the approach will be this. Right? So I look at the literature. Mormons that just says that the trust is one's willingness to rely on other parties in whom one has confidence. It's a willingness and has a confidence. The other part would be, right, so looking at the Morgan, there's another from the literature. It also says about confidence. The other part that they ask, that Morgan and Hunt actually come up with, in the exchange of margins, reliability, and integrity. So there are another two more, I would say, dimensions to trust. The other one would be looking over here. The other literature that came out with, so trust is one's willingness to be vulnerable to the actions of other parties. So when we look into this and we refine from the literature, that's why literature review is so important. It's not just about it's a checkbox of things to do. It's about getting all those correct. And then we define it into our questions, into definitions of trust. Right? So in this case, we only want to define what is trust that relates to our definitions, that relates to our studies. So by drawing from the literature, this is how we come out with, right? So this is how I come out with. The trust is the level of confidence that one has in other parties' reliability and integrity, and therefore willingly accept the risk associated with one's actions. Right, and all this, right? So we draw this from the literature. So now we have a confidence. There's one dimension. We have reliability. There's another questions, another dimensions. Integrity is also another dimensions, and willingness. Right. And then we define, and then we formulate the questions to capture these four dimensions. So this is how I come out with, right? Security. This is about the online security, the confidence, the online security. The online transactions, right? So the security of transactions is reliable. We measure straight away the reliability, right? And then we have confidence in the security of the transactions again, right? So there's one there, and then we have willing, and then integrity, and of course this is more like a summary. So I just put it there. Right? Security of the transactions is trustworthy. These are summaries of how confident, how trusting, how how trustworthy the anti-transactions is, right? And it's a 5 anchor level. And then these are basically, if we formulate that, that becomes the indicators for the trust. So if you're running the PLS, right, the partial least square, so you might have, all right, so you might want to define this from the first question. So this is a value for indicator from the second question, and so on and so forth. That becomes the trust over here. It's measured through all these 5 different questions, right? 5 different dimensions that make up the trust itself. All right, that's clear. That's how we define. That's why literature review is so important for us to define what we try to actually achieve. Okay, so once we're done with that, we do the pilot. Right, so run the pilot, right, to test whether the instruments are actually right. Typically, we can go to about 30 to 40. That will be fine, just to make sure that the questions translate into or read or understood by the potential respondents the way that we want it to be understood. Okay, the reason why we do the pilot is because we don't know what we don't know. That pilot's actually pilot testing that you spark some valuable information. It's shined through, and we obviously want to make sure that the data is basically reliable. And of course, if it mentions in our studies or in I would say paper that we sent out, reviewers will normally appreciate that we have done a pilot study, right? So, and that will be something that we might want to look at. I'm running out of time, so very quickly, just want to go with the to the validity and reliability. I believe that concludes why we need to have the literature review, what to ask, and how to ask, right? And then of course look at the anchor, right? So look at the anchor of our response. Right? So the other part will be the validity and reliability of the instruments, right? So give you an example over here. I'll give you an example. I'm so hungry. I'm keep thinking about the roti canai. And over here, we call it roti as well. It's so popular. The locals actually call it roti. I don't know why they don't call it roti canai. Maybe the roti canai is really hard to pronounce. But they call it roti down here. So let's have a look at this example. To analogy of reliability and validity of our instruments. This roti is hot, and it's 37. Unfortunately, it is 37 kilos. If we have this roti, and then I think the mama store will have an issue. Really hard to get people to the stores and to the stalls if every time that people ask for roti canai, and then they say it's about 37, 31 kilos. So every time you eat, you gain 37 kilos. Not a good way to promote your product. Right. So that is something we need to look at. Sometimes the instrument is good, the thermometer is good, but the measurements given is wrong. All right, so that's something we might want to be looking at. So again, when it comes to make sure that the instrument is good, the survey is good, we have to make sure that we look at the validity and reliability of the instruments. Validity is hard. It's not that hard. It's a bit challenging. Let me face that. It's a bit challenging to come out with. Typically, for those actually running SEM or even PLS, this fauna and Likert criterion is a normal thing that we do. All right, so I'll give you an example over here. This is from the book, all right? From my book coming up in May. All right, we have 3 different latent variables over here. We have intentions, we have ease of use, and usefulness. Right? And then, this is what we call the fauna and Likert criterion for the discriminant validity. What it means is that it measures what it measures. The instrument, the question measures what it's supposed to measure. The thermometer measures only the temperature, not the kilograms. This is what we do. Right? So on the diagonal, we normally put something like, it is AVE or average variance extracted. The square roots of average variance extracted for each and every single latent variable. I come back to that when we go through the formula later. And then the off-diagonal items are the correlations between, not the items, but the latent variables. In this case, ease of use, the correlation between ease of use and intention. So how it is correlated. Right? So what the strength of correlations over here. What we want to have is that the values on the diagonals are more than
more than all the other values here. So which means that our variable that actually measure things that they are designed to measure. It doesn't measure anything else. That thermometer only measures 37 degrees, not 37 kilos. So that's what we want to find. Right? So this is and it's a little bit hard to do. Not so many people actually do that. I really appreciate it. And when I review paper, I always look for this, just to make sure that everything's all good. Right, how to calculate? You have to calculate manually. Unfortunately, you have to take what we call the SSL, the sum of square loading divided by the numbers of items. So if you have, just like the trust example that I gave you earlier, we have 5 different questions asking 5 different dimensions of trust. Right? And then those 5 are actually the n. Right? So that will be the n, the numbers of items in that measurements. The sum of square loading, that will be the factor loading. That will be the factor loading. It took me ages to come out with the AVE before. It was so hard when I was doing my PhD a couple of years back. I think a long time ago. Getting old. But eventually I got so frustrated and I wrote a program for it, for the SPSS. Made it available for free, just for fun. Just to voice out how frustrating it was to calculate the AVE. And unfortunately, it was pretty good. I did this, and I really started to for public use free of charge in 2015, and that was meant for SPSS version 22. Then version 23 onward, they changed lots of other stuff behind the scene, so it no longer works. I might just reprogram or rewrite the programs for this. For the time being, I'm enjoying myself with loads of other data. All right. Anyway, you can do this manually as well. I'll give you a very similar. Use SPSS. What you need to do, come out with run. You just have to run a factor analysis to get the AVE. Just run it. And then factor analysis to get a factor score. Basically, when you run a factor analysis, you can get the AVE, you can save the factor scores. All right, so that factor score is actually really much what you need to go to calculate the correlations later down the road. All right, I think I have some examples over here. So technically, I'm not sure whether you can see this. Give an example over here. So SPSS, we can go to the dimension reductions, factor analysis, run it. So I give you for 5 different questions over here. Descriptive, we don't need much on the descriptives, right? So just leave it as it is. The things that you might want to set over here would be make sure that you want to extract the exact amount of the factor over here. In this case, I use only one. I know that it's about support. I want to measure support with 5 different questions. So there's only one factor to extract. We tell SPSS that that's only one factor that we want to extract. The other thing that you might want to do is to save the factor score. So typically we use a regressions of factor score. Just continue and then save that. Oh, by the way, when it comes to rotations, don't rotate. Just leave it as it is. And then press OK. You will get the output. So technically, this is the component that you extract. That will be your AVE. As simple as that. This is only this is about 0.5026. Right? So 50%, yeah, it is. Well, technically that's it. Right? So that's your AVE. And then of course, when you run, but remember when you click save the factor score, so that will be the factor score. That will be your support variable. Right? So it's support. Right? So I was measuring support. So this is the latent variable for support. Assuming this is trust, and that will be the trust score for your variable. That's a really simple thing to do, rather than waiting for me to reprogram my plugins, SPSS. All right, and then you can run a correlation between the factor scores to get this. Right, so to get this, the correlation between one latent variable to another, and it's only available, it's only required if you have latent variable. But if you have, if your survey is actually directly measure one thing, you don't have to do this. Right? So you don't really have to do it. The other part will be the reliability. Right? So when it comes to reliability, it's very simple. Normally we use a Chromebook Ultra. right? So in the SPSS, you just go to the analyze, go to skill, and that will be a reliability analysis. Right, so in reliability, a couple of things that you might want to highlight, things which is very useful. Look at the item descriptive for items, you know what average, the mean, right? And the scale itself, and the scale if item deleted, because sometimes your scale is not that good. You might want, if you drop one item, what will happen to your with estimated values of the combat alpha. All right, so correlations you might want to look at as well. This is more like a diagnosis, right? So I always do look at the inter-item correlation to see whether the correlation is too strong. If the correlation is almost perfect, typically we might be tapping into the same dimensions of the latent variable. For example, we ask questions about how old are you. The other one is when you were born. So the correlation is perfect. So if we have perfect correlation, it doesn't mean that these two questions actually measuring things that are really good, right? They are basically asking the same exact question, the same exact items, just the way that we rephrase, we write the questions that make it seemingly different, but they are measuring the same thing. So highly correlated items is not good either. All right, so that will be something that you might want to look at. And of course, when it comes to reliability statistic, that will be the combat alpha. Typically, we're looking at more than minimum is 0.70 by Nunley, right? So 1975. So in this case, it's 0.83, so it's more than 0.70, which is absolutely great. So we can say that our items is basically reliable. All right, so that will be it. So yep, I took more than I was supposed to. And so now 56, we have 4 more minutes. I think that should be all right. So I think that will be for me about the nuts and bolts when it comes to survey-based research. Right. And yep, I leave it to Amira. I think Amira is ready for the interview. Yeah, sure.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Yep. Okay. Thank you, Doctor, for the very informative presentation. Yep. It's nearing 11 right now, but that's fine. We'll now open the Q&A session from participants, and we can start with Madam Tahira's question on the chat column.
Okay. Yeah. So
yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Amira. So Tahira had actually asked, can we conclude? I'm reading the question from Tahira. Can we conclude the demographic will be based on the culture, country, variable investigated as well? So technically, demographic tells us about a person. So it's not about what we want to find. It's about that describe who the person is. Right? Yes, the culture, the country. Apart from the age, right? So there is what we call the demographic. Sometimes we might want, if our questions is about students in a certain university, we might want to find out which university that they are currently in. All right. Any other questions apart from that?
Yeah, Dr. Saiyidi.
Yes, sorry, yes.
I would like to bring attention to the first part of your presentation where you mentioned about the need to dig into the credibility and reliability of your data, where you explain about the G power and whether the data set is representative or your sample is representative.
Oh, yeah.
So if you put yourself as an examiner, all right, so would you expect that part to be explained by the student, a postgraduate student, either PhD or master level? Because the way I see it, it has a very great impact to their findings. So we do not want to have findings saying usually the positive way, but the data set in the opposite ways, right? So it is interesting to note that it could provide an answer why your number of sample is large or why your number of sample is low. If you could apply the G power, for instance. So back to my question, would we expect any postgraduate student to explain this part of section in their thesis?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Shabul, on that. So I'm
It's
more on the
11 o'clock.
quant-side types of the analysis. So I do personally, I would rather see that explanations whether the sample size is good enough. So again, the idea when it comes to research, coming back to the idea of the research, it's not just getting the research done. It's about whether our findings is generalizable. Can be extended beyond the sample? Whether that can be applied to the populations. So obviously there are two things, as I mentioned earlier, where we're looking at the whether it is credible and whether it is whether it is reliable. Also reliability, obviously we look at the statistical. So we need to look at what will be the minimum sample size. Right? So that minimum sample size will dictate whether or not if we the thing is when we have the hypothesis testing, if we what we want to make sure is that the findings that statistical parts that we find, the coefficients or the regressions or perhaps the correlations is actually we found it not by chance. So it's not by chance that we actually found it. Obviously, the p-value tells us indicate whether it is by chance or whether that is representative of a sample. So from my point of view, it's always a good idea for the student to explain to explain why that many sample size that they actually came out with. Right. So in my from the examiner's point of view, it's just a matter of making sure that the process to get to analyze data or to run the research is actually I would say replicable. Right. So I do expect the student to explain that in terms of what will be the basis of having 100. What will be the basis of having 200 samples? What will be the basis of you running that analysis of coming out with or sending the questions to those particular groups of respondents? So it's not about finding fault. It's more about making the derive at the end that the findings is actually there. They spent 3 years in the PhD programs. Those findings are actually correct. Somehow, is it not actually exactly correct, but it's representative of the entire population because somehow, someday, I'll be using that findings or some other people as well. Well, I hope I answered that question.
Yeah. Thank you, Doctor.
Right. Okay. Is there any other questions?
Yes.
Yes, Brother Raja, yes.
Right, okay. Hi, thank you very much, Dr. Saiyidi, for your very insightful sharing and presentation. I actually enjoy your presentation and your sharing. Okay. You did mention just now about the anchor your skill properly, about the Vegas 2006, if I'm not mistaken, about the lighted scale. Okay, just to get your opinion, okay, we have the lighted scale, like most of the lighted scale that you mentioned just now, they are all odd numbers, like 5 point, 7 point. Okay, I just get your opinion about the even numbers because normally in the middle, it will be the neutral. Okay, one of my friends did, when she did her PhD, she said that if they ask questions in Malaysia, most likely they will be the respondent would like to choose in the middle, that means the neutral. And so one of the way to overcome, she said, is that using even numbers like 6 point or 4 point. But I'm not sure about it because I'm not into this one. Just to get your opinion about it. Thank you.
All right, thanks for that. So when we measure, this is interesting. This is not the first time I have a similar question before, Dr. Raja. So technically, yeah, it is very interesting. Some people just pick up right in the middle. So that's fun. I don't want to be seen as leaning to the left. I don't want to be seen leaning to the right either. Just right in the middle. It's a good thing. However, because when we measure stuff, all right. So when we measure I would say the responses. We measure in a continuum, which means that there is a bottom half and there's also in the top half. And right in the middle is a continuum. This is like negative frequency. That's why we have these odd numbers. I would say that that is not wrong, right, to remove that middle part because of the approach that we want to go to. Right. So I've seen that even in PISA. Right. The PISA data, where we're talking about 90 countries in the world that participate in the PISA, the Program for International Student Assessment, and 200,000 students, they do have even number. They don't have that middle part altogether.
Okay, because they want to get to, not skewed, like they want to know whether they agree or disagree, kind of just to get that idea rather than everything is in the middle.
Yes. It's more like how we need to contextualize the way that we contextualize the ideas of promoting that. Look into the scenarios and of course where our respondent comes from. So that might help. So it's more like tactical. I don't think that it has more. I would say it does have impact, but it's not that significant enough to say that to have 5 and 4, we remove the middle ground doesn't have any impact to the in terms of responses. But again, it's more on the tactical aspects of coming up with the questions. I do agree. Yeah, and as I said, PISA, this is multi-million dollars OECD research over 90 countries in the world. Up to 2018, they have more than 3 million responses already. So it's not wrong. It's not wrong. It depends on the context of the research. Thank you, Dr. Raja, for
thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, no worries. Any other questions? Oh, don't worry, I don't have any class today, so it's kind of good. And yeah, the only thing that's not good, I'm running low on my coffee. All right, anything else that that you like to share? Any questions I'd like to you want to highlight, or anything that you might want to basically share? Right. I should have.
One more thing, Doctor.
Yes.
Talking about pilot study.
Oh, yeah.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So what would be the best way to explain our finding in the if we use our pilot study samples? Because normally they will be it has been tested, it has been acceptable by their sample or by their respondent. They don't have any question. They can answer the question very well. They understand the questions. So what would be the best way to explain our pilot study results?
I think, thank you, Dr. Sharon, on the questions again. And when it comes to the pilot study, what we want to find out when it comes to pilot study is whether we can refine the instruments, especially when we refining the instruments before the actual research or the actual data collection is made. I did have some experience, couple of times that when we run, even after the pilot study is done, we're still missing out few bits and pieces because the data speaks something else. We understand things the way that we understand as a researcher, but the respondent understand things that the way that it is presented, and it shows in the data itself. If you want, for the student to actually come out with an explanations what the pilot study is, just highlight what is the purpose of the pilot study. Are we looking to validate the instruments before the actual data collections, or are we looking at the content of the of the instruments itself, whether we capture or whether that is actually translated in a way that that we design it to capture. All right. So again, highlight the purpose of the I would say of the pilot study. That will be the best idea or the best way to explain the I would say the results of the pilot. And obviously, some people just say because this is adapted, the instrument is actually adapted from established literature, so we are confident. So therefore, there is no pilot studies tested. I'm not that comfortable with that because sometimes, even though the instruments are actually being used in so many other research before, it might be that the populations of interest in our study might have a different understanding. So that will be something you might want to highlight. And then, of course, some research didn't actually go through a very lengthy pilot project. It just run through the instrument, run the instrument to the experts in the field to find out whether there is a good what we call this phase validity. Right? So what we sometimes we in the correction we call it a nomological validity of the instruments. So the phase values of the instrument, whether they are actually there. So if that's the case, then just highlight that the purpose of the pilot study is to get the nomological validity rather than understanding from the responses. So presenting the pilot output of the pilot is good because it tells the reviewers and the examiners that that the students or the students or the researchers, the groups of the researchers try to look into very carefully. They take every precaution necessary to make sure that whatever the output that they catch, whatever they are, the values or the findings that came out from the research is basically tested, and the research itself is replicable. It was performed or conducted in a careful manner. I think that's the main idea. The other things, my apologies for other participants, for those that actually become or will be becoming reviewers or examiners. The things that we looked at when it comes to research is not questioning whether this has been done, that has been done, this has not been done. It's more about asking whether sufficient care had been taken when the research was conducted. That's the idea. It's not the checklist mentality. It's more about the spirits of what to be done. If the extra care has been done, now as a reviewers or examiners, I always look at, yes, the extra care has been done. There's some slack over there, but it's not significantly affecting the outcomes or the output, because we are looking at whether the process is actually being done. That's it. I think that's it. I think I went too far ahead about the questions of how to report a pilot study. The thing is, just mentioned whether the pilot study is done because we want to look at the nomological validity, which means a phase validity, where we look at or we consult with the experts in the field, or we want to see whether the participant will understand the questions the way that we want them to understand it, or both. It could be done this way. All right. Thank you, Dr. Shara. I think that will be.
Yeah, thank you very much, Doctor. I really appreciate your views.
Thanks. So I leave it to Dr. Rashid. Regarding the survey questionnaire, how many appropriate questions for each items or variables? Dr. Rashidin. All right. So thank you for the questions. All right. Here's the fun part when it comes to did I have I'm not sure whether can you see the screen or you see my camera?
We can see your slide, Doctor.
Oh, you can see my slide. Oh, okay, all right. That's fine. So because I'm just stretching myself, I just need to make sure that my cameras, you don't see me when I'm stretching myself. Well, but anyway, Dr. Narashik asked about the question, how many questions is appropriate for each latent variable, right? Or how many items? I would say minimum is 3. That's a bare minimum. If you're running PLS, partial least square, minimum is 3. However, this is a danger of having the minimum questions per latent variable. 3 per latent variable. If one of the questions is not related or does not correlate well with the other 2, you might have to drop 1. So you left it only 2. Right? So I normally look at about 4 to 5 questions for each latent variable, just in case one variable, one question does not tap really well, or perhaps it was misunderstood by the respondent, that I have to drop 1 item. If I have 5, dropping 1 item, still have 4, which is good. And then if we have 4, if we drop another one, then we have 3. So 3 is bare minimum. If you have only 2 questions for 2 items to measure latent variable, that is highly questionable, and then it's really hard to get to justify to the reviewers saying that this is the actual measurements, or these are the 2 questions can tap into the latent variable very well. Because statistically speaking, it's not that strong. It's not the matter of the substance of the questions, it's a matter of the statistical approach. Statistically, if you have only 2 or less, or perhaps 1 or 2 indicators for your latent variable, that is almost disaster approach. Right? So 4, I would say, is a good way. 5, even better, but not too much, because sometimes if it's too much, you might be tapping into the same dimensions of your latent variable. This is where we have Cronbach alpha of 0.95. It's so good until you look at those questions and look at the item correlation and find out, okay, that's a strong correlation between 2 items, which means that 1 item has to be dropped, because they just might be measuring the same thing. Right. I hope I answered the question, your question, Dr. Narashkin.
Right. Are there any more questions before we end our webinar for today? If there isn't, then I'll be proceeding with the closing it. Okay, Doctor?
Oh, sorry, there's one more question. Tahira, how to get a book? Bagaimana nak dapatkan buku tu? Which book? So, I'll send the link. The first one over here, the conducting quantitative research and education, is more on the the focus is on the non-parametric test. So on the non-parametric test. The second book, which is coming up in May, that will be mostly on the parametric. Right? So mostly on parametric tests with the SPSS. Both are actually SPSS. I use SPSS. How to get those? You can go to the, let me just check, conducting research in education. I need to go to the website, the actual screen of Windows. That will be the one. I forgot the names. Okay, that will be the. You can order that. So basically, this is from from Springer. I don't have any control of the prices. It used to be 90 something euros. Sadly, even though it says it's Singapore, the license is from Singapore. Basically, the company that you have is in Germany. Springer is actually in Germany, so they went for the European market. That's why it is in euro. It used to be 90 something at the start. I think they made Springer made lots of money out of it. They reduced the price within less than a year after it's I think 67. Right. Within less than a year. So you can get the book from here. You can order online, or you can have it soft cover, hard cover as well. I think the hard cover is really expensive, or the ebook. For the second book, let me just have a look. Data analysis. Now you can see all the other stuff that are doing. All right, so this is the 2021. They keep on changing the price. It used to be about 83. Now it's good because it says 74. It's not. This is estimated price, I suppose, until they got everything done. All right. Now they changed the date as well. It used to be 8th of May. Now it is 22nd. It's always good to spring. And what I can do, I can send this. I can send the links to the organizer, Dr. Sharo. Then Dr. Sharo can share with the rest of the participants. Right. Thank you, Tahira, for asking that questions. Yes. Amira, I'll leave it to Amira.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Doctor. Okay, with that being said, thank you, Doctor, for answering the questions from our participants and also to those who participated in the Q&A session. I believe that today's webinar has definitely been a very informative and very knowledgeable session. And it was an absolute pleasure. Before we end the meeting, let's first recite Tasbih Kifarah and Surah Al-Nas. And
thank you again for.
Yeah.
Thank you again for inviting me. This is a really good opportunity. Thank you for those actual participants participating in these sessions. I look forward to have another session later. So, Dr. Sharo, thank you. Dr. Raima, thank you so much. And Amira, you've been great. Thanks.
Thank you, Doctor. All right. So this is the end of the session. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Don't forget to fill in your attendance. There's a QR code here and also a link in the chat column for you to fill in. And afterward, you are able to leave the meeting. Thank you so much for participating. We do hope that Dr. Sayidi's tips and tricks and sharing session has greatly impacted everyone. And have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm leaving.
All right. Thank you, Doctor.
All right, thanks. I think I can leave the sessions. All right.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Amira, thank you. Pandai, Amira, handle event. Okay.
Alhamdulillah. Thank you, Doctor.